Welcome to this edition of Real World Government Contracts Law, a podcast where we discuss real world issues and legal updates impacting government contractors. I'm Stephanie Wilson. I'm a partner here at Berenzweig, Leonard, and a director of our firm's government contracts practice.
I'm Terry O'Connor, also a partner here at Berenzweig, Leonard, and director of government contracts.
So today, Terry and I are here to discuss debriefings, which are an important part of the procurement process as they provide contractors with an opportunity to receive feedback on their proposal from the government. And so, Terry, this is a topic that you and I discuss frequently with clients who want to get as much information as possible from the government on why they may have lost a contract. And so today we'll provide sort of an overview of that debriefing process as well as some tips for an effective debriefing. So to get started in our discussion, I think it'd be good to provide a little bit of background. And so, Terry, can you explain, so after an offeror first learns that they have not received a contract award, what kind of feedback can that offeror get from the government?
Well, there are really four kinds of feedback. And as a general overview, I think the best thing that has happened for contractors probably in the last, 30 or 40 years has been the ability to get feedback on their proposals. I mean, this didn't come in until the late 90s. And when it did, it came in relatively slowly and in a bit of a disorganized way. There are really four types of feedback you can get. Two are not very helpful. There is a brief explanation required when someone loses a federal supply schedule contract. There's a brief explanation, which is a little more described and a little more specific of what a contracting officer has to do for simplified acquisitions, and so that's procurements under $250,000. The one that I think people really want to be aware of is a required debriefing, and that's what we're going to be spending most of this podcast talking about. There's also, by default, a voluntary debriefing. When people miss the various deadlines we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes, the government can give them a debriefing. Contractors can ask for one, and it's possible that the government will give you one.
So you mentioned a required debriefing, and I know that's going to be our focus of our discussion today. So what is really so special about a required debriefing compared to some of the other types of feedback?
Yeah, the best part of a required debriefing is you get a lot more information. It's very specific what the contracting officer is supposed to give you. We'll talk in a couple of minutes about whether you actually get all that information. But the advantage of a required debriefing is that it's very clear. The regulations are very clear what the government is supposed to give you as a result of the required debriefing.
And so when is a debriefing required and when is it not?
Well, this gets tricky. A required debriefing is associated with RFPs under FAR Part 15 and also IDIQ task orders under FAR Part 16 if the value of the contract that's awarded for the task order is in excess of $6 million.
So one of the things you mentioned was that there's a deadline that offers will need to meet in order to get that required debriefing. So what are the deadlines that offers need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important deadlines in the whole solicitation process. It's a 3-day deadline, and you don't want to miss out on the 3-day deadline. And specifically, what it is, it's within 3 days of a contractor learning that they lost, they have to get into the contracting officer's hand a request for a debriefing, required debriefing. You don't need any magic words in the request. And what typically happens, I think, is our clients get an unsuccessful offeror notice by email, and by return email, they ask for the required debriefing. But again, it's got to be within 3 days and into the contracting officer's hands. You don't send it out in 3 days. The issue is it's got to be in the contracting officer's hands within 3 days.
How does that apply to offers that are excluded before the award is made? So if they don't make it into the competitive range, or there's, they're told that, they don't have a chance of making it to the next step of a phased solicitation.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. These required debriefings can come in two varieties, really. A pre-award debriefing, like you just suggested, and a post-award debriefing. The pre-award is, like you say, if they're thrown out of the competitive range, for example, or they simply don't qualify for the next stage of the procurement. And this gets a little tricky, too, because pre-award protest or a pre-award debriefing occurs before the award decision has been made. So the way the structure of the pre-award debriefing is set up, unsuccessful offerors, again, within 3 days, have to request a pre-award debriefing. The government has the choice of saying, no, we're going to wait until after all the awards have been made, and then we'll give you the debriefing. If the contractor takes that first approach of asking for a pre-award debriefing pre-award, it can also have the choice of postponing the pre-award to post-award. And if a contractor voluntarily decides to postpone the debriefing until after awards have been made, there's an advantage to it. Basically, you get more information with a post-award debriefing than you would under your pre-award debriefing. So there's something in it for contractors if they want to postpone. There are also some disadvantages in terms of protesting, but we're going to stay away from that.
Yeah, I know those always are a sort of a complicated issue, and I know and we'll discuss this later that you've kind of delved into those in a little bit more depth. But so we've talked a lot about disappointed offerers, and so what if you've been awarded the contract? Are you still entitled to receive a debriefing?
Yeah, this is something that some winning offerors forget about. You have the right, even though you won, to get a debriefing. And I guess the question is, well, why would you? You won. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is, why not start a good relationship with your customer by having a meeting, shortly after you win the contract. But also, I think you want to find out what you did right and wrong. You won, so you must have done an awful lot of stuff right. But there's no harm in finding out how you, too, could have improved your proposal in the long run.
Yeah, and I think related to that also, and I know we're not going to spend time on protests. That's something we could certainly save for another podcast, but that I think it can also be beneficial if you are expecting that your award is going to be protested, to get a little bit more information about what the agency thought of your proposal, and maybe even get a little bit of a head start being able to intervene and defend that protest if you know a little bit more about how your proposal was evaluated.
Yeah, that's a good point. The contracting officer is supposed to keep a record of all the debriefings. And so if you, as the winner, don't get a debriefing, all right, well, then I guess you can see the contracting officer's file on what the contracting officer told all the unsuccessful offerors if it has to go back out on the street for some reason. But I think it's easier and more straightforward to get the debriefing yourself.
Right, yeah. So when you then have the debriefing, what information is a bidder entitled to, at least under the FAR? What does the FAR say that a contractor should be able to receive at a debriefing?
Yeah, I like your choice of words, entitled to, because I think you're referring to the fact that what you're entitled to, you don't get all the time. I think one of the biggest problems with required debriefings is that contractors don't get all the information that they're really entitled to. I think you have to go into a debriefing with real low expectations. Don't expect that you're going to get all the information that FAR says the contracting officer shall give you. A lot of times they don't give you all the information you're supposed to get. The information that, actually there's a federal statute, and also the FAR says these are pieces of information you're supposed to get, and they don't always give it to you. So, for example, at a minimum, the pre-award debriefing is basically supposed to say the significant elements of why the offeror's proposal, why they were thrown out, an evaluation of elements of their proposal in addition to why they were thrown out. And also this thing called, and we're going to be talking about this in post-award as well, reasonable responses to relevant, and I'm reading the statute and regulation, reasonable responses to relevant questions about whether source selection procedures contained in the solicitation, applicable regulations, and other applicable authorities were followed in the process of eliminating the offer from the competition. In other words, it sounds weird. The contracting officer is supposed to tell you all the laws and regulations that the agency broke in throwing you out of the competition. I mean, it seems like a really dumb requirement. And I think the advantage to contracting officers is these procurements routinely are just too complex. They're going to make a mistake. In every procurement, there's going to be a screw-up. But a lot of times those screw-ups aren't going to result in somebody else winning the contract. Usually they're harmless error. They're minor things. And this provision about reasonable responses to relevant questions is designed to let the contracting officer say, yeah, I made a mistake, I screwed up here, but you still would have lost.
That I think you covered was the pre-award, right? So from a post-award debriefing, there's some additional information as well.
Yeah, in a post-award debriefing, the agency is supposed to tell you, give you their own evaluation of significant weaknesses or deficiencies in the proposal, as well as the overall evaluated cost and technical rating of the successful offeror and the contractor getting debriefed. So it's basically the price and rating. In addition, they're supposed to give the overall ranking of all offerors. They're supposed to give a summary of the rationale for award. And when there's commercial items, they're supposed to identify the commercial item. And again, the last one is this reasonable responses to relevant questions that I mentioned before. But like I said before, contractors don't always get all this information that they're supposed to. For example, some contracting officers don't want to give the overall ranking of all offerors. They'll tell you, you finished first, or you finished, say, fifth, and the winner finished first. And what you as a contractor want to learn is, well, where did my competition come in? And who was my competition? And the language seems to suggest that the overall ranking of all offerors, what I've heard is contracting officers will say, well, the winner won, you know that, you finished fifth, offeror A finished second, offeror B finished third, and offeror D finished fourth. Well, there was no offeror A, B, and C. You want to know who they were. Routinely, contracting officers don't want to tell you that. They say our job as the government is not to give you commercial intelligence, despite the fact that the regulation says they're supposed to.
Mm-hmm. I think related to that, one thing that more agencies are doing is they're not even they're claiming they don't rank the offerors, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah,
there's no, if they don't rank them 1 to 10, they don't really tell you where they fall, when obviously they have to. There is some sort of internal ranking that has to go on to ultimately make the decision.
Yeah, sure there is.
If they don't do a formal ranking, yeah.
I mean, as a practical matter, if I'm a contracting officer and I know I'm debriefing someone who finished 5th out of 5, I would tell them, you finished 5th out of 5, because, go ahead, try to protest. How lucky
Right.
do you feel? You're not going to win. If you're 5th out of 5, it's not going to happen. But contracting officers are just so skittish, and we'll get into that too, why they're skittish.
It ties back to when you were talking about requesting additional information. I know a lot of times what we'll advise clients is when they are submitting that request for a debriefing, to go ahead and put their questions right in that request. Give the government a heads up what additional questions they're going to ask at the debriefing. And I think that you're more likely to hopefully get some response from the agency if you give them that heads up.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time doing that, don't we? Drafting questions. And the other thing, too, there's no harm in asking contracting officers for this information. Typically, it's interesting, FARS doesn't say that you have to be told what your strengths were. But if I'm a contracting officer, I would want to tell you what your strengths were. I want to try and keep you around for the next round. If you're in one of those procurements where there are only a few contractors in a given niche and the contracting officer has to deal with those niche offerors, I think you'd want to try to the extent you can, keep those offerors happy by telling them what their strengths were. The other thing is some of the agencies have actually put out debriefing guidelines. For example, DOD, Treasury, NASA, DHS has a real pretty detailed description of what contracting officers can tell contractors during their briefing. The interesting thing is we've had a couple of unsuccessful DHS offerors, and we've told them, go to the book, go to the DHS book, and we've heard afterwards that DHS won't even, in these circumstances, haven't even followed their own book. So I mean, there are guidelines out there. The other thing to look at, there's in 2017, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy put out what they call a memo on myth busting. And in the myth busting memo, they actually suggested questions that contracting officers should be prepared to ask and answer. Contracting officers should be prepared to answer. So, I mean, if OFPP thinks those are fair questions, if I'm a contractor, I try to ask those questions myself.
I know we've talked about sort of the standard FAR debriefing, and DoD offers this enhanced debriefings process. Can you provide a little bit of information on what that looks like?
Yeah, this is an idea that might be creeping over from DOD and into the civilian. So far it hasn't happened, but I think it's going to happen in the long run. Yeah, it's called an enhanced debriefing. The enhanced debriefing basically is that after the debriefing is over, contractors have the right within 2 business days to submit additional questions to DOD. DOD then has 5 business days to answer those questions. And until those questions are answered, the debriefing is not over. And basically any kind of protest clock has not started to run yet. So I think this is an opportunity for DOD to try and give contractors more information to keep them from protesting to get information. And once they get the information, they back out of the protest, but in the meantime, they've wasted their time and money. They've wasted a contracting officer's time and effort. Give them the information up front.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, right now, only DoD is required to provide these enhanced debriefings, but we've seen a number of areas where DoD is sort of the test case, and then it expands into the civilian agency. So I agree. I think we'll see something similar in the next few years on the civilian side.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about, what a contractor needs to do to get the debriefing and submitting the questions. How do you recommend that particularly a disappointed bidder approach a debriefing?
Yeah. To start off with an example, I had a client that thought that it was a good idea to take a court reporter into an oral debriefing with the government. Can you imagine the signal that that's sending the contracting officer? When you do something that dumb, you're not going to get an awful lot of information. We try to push the idea, don't make a debriefing adversarial. You're not going to get that much information. The more adversarial it is, the less information you're going to get. You and I have gone around and given talks on making a debriefing a marketing opportunity. You have a marvelous one-on-one chance to impress a contracting officer that you can do the work the next time. And to take that marketing opportunity and mess it up is really not a good practice. You got to understand, I think, the mindset of a debriefing. You have contracting officers who are not necessarily real warm and fuzzy about doing one of these things. they don't want to give you that much information to start with. They're afraid you're going to protest. Frankly, my experience with contracting officers is they're overworked and underpaid, and they're not awfully enthused about doing an awful lot more work for a debriefing. In addition, they're risk averse. They're afraid of protest, and they're also afraid of personal liability if they give out proprietary information on other offerors or the winner. So basically, they want to give you as little information as possible. And on the other hand, you walk in there as a contractor, you're terribly disappointed. You've spent a lot of BMP money and time. So you're tempted to try and defend your proposal, and you're trying to convince the contracting officer to, right then and there, give you the contract. Well, that's not going to happen. People in your firm, your company, can lose their job because you didn't get the proposal successfully awarded to you. So I think the adversarial approach is just the wrong approach to take. It's just not, I think, good common sense to do that. Marketing, we keep saying marketing is the way that you should really use the debriefing process effectively.
Yeah, and I think, to follow up on that point, the marketing is not just finding out, what sort of your strengths and weaknesses were on this particular proposal, but often you can find out, is there similar work that's going to be put out, a proposal or a solicitation coming out in the coming months that, you may not have been aware of, and the contracting officer or the agency may encourage you to bid for it. I mean, just because you didn't win that particular contract, it doesn't necessarily mean that the agency was not impressed by your proposal, wouldn't have considered you, for other work. And so I think that that's, like you said, a marketing opportunity, not only to find out how you could make your proposal better, but what other opportunities are out there that might be a better fit for your particular company.
Yeah, that's a great point, because contracting officers, from my experience, are very reluctant to talk to contractors about future opportunities. But there you are. You're in a one-on-one situation with a contracting officer. You're being nice. You're working, trying to work with them. If all you have to do is convince the contracting officer that, all the sections in FAR that say contracting officers are supposed to talk to contractors about future work, they don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. And that's, like you say, that's a perfect opportunity to look for what's down the road.
And so, I know we don't advocate to have the focus of a debriefing be on, sort of gathering intel for a protest. But, sometimes that is something that obviously contractors are considering, and the debriefing is an important step in that process if they are going to protest a contract. But what do you think is sort of, when you're talking about the mindset? I mean, it's almost like you have to go into it with these sort of dual intentions, both to get as much information as possible while also maintaining that good relationship with the government. I mean, what are your thoughts on using debriefings to gather information for a protest?
I think what I think you and I have told people in these kinds of situations is try to convince the contracting officer as best you can that you're not going to protest. I mean, even I've told people to say something as naive as, contracting officer, we are not going to protest. It's a waste of our time and money, and we're here to figure out how we can do it better. Now, they might not believe you, but that's, a straightforward approach like that. You'd surprise the daylights out of them. But that's being straightforward and honest with them, and no harm in doing that. Like I say, I'm not sure they're going to believe you, but that's straightforward. And again, you're trying to develop a good relationship with the contracting officer. That's one way to do it.
So, Terry, I want to thank you for a great discussion. If anyone wants any more information on this topic, Terry has a blog post on our firm website that goes into more detail. And of course, you can reach out to either one of us if you have any questions. And so thank you, everyone, for joining us for this edition of Real World Government Contracts Law.